you want to tell us where we're at today?
Well, this is the former Bethlehem Lutheran Church, which was built in 1912 in the country about 3 miles from here, and stood there until 1950 when it was brought into this little hamlet. In 1950, then it was extended. The front part here was extended 10 feet and one extra window. There are 5 windows down the side now, and there were only 4. So basically the alcove there was added on. The pews that you see in here are not original. They were changed in probably the early 60s. And the building inside, when it was brought into town here, then was put on a basement and was completely redone with this Tentest fiber kind of board. And they painted it with this pink and beige stripe. And it has been exactly the same as you see it here now for these 56 years, from 50 until we're here now at 2006. The congregation dwindled slowly, less and less people, to the point where they didn't have, it was part of a 3-point parish with Davin and Vibank. And when they could no longer afford, increasing wages and things, then they were served by somebody who would come from Regina, from the university, or one of the churches would come and serve the congregation on a Sunday. But it lacked Sunday school and other activities, so people gradually started to join I believe there's 17 Lutheran churches in Regina, and anybody goes to wherever they please. And so the people that were attending here in the early 90s were basically former residents who would drive from Regina to Krono so that they could attend church here. So eventually, as one by one they died off, and it got less and less. They were down to 10 or 12 people attending church. The decision became imminent that you're going to have to cease operation. And so at that point we had already organized the cemetery. The cemetery was being run by what we call the cemetery committee under the auspices of this church. That is for as far as the Constitution and as far as tax receipts and stuff were concerned. But now the church closed in August of 1996, and the remaining members voted to give it over to the committee that was looking after the cemetery, provided that we would attempt to maintain it and keep it and preserve it. So we had to reorganize, and we became the Krono Bethlehem Heritage Society Incorporated. We're incorporated in the province of Saskatchewan. We acquired a tax number for tax receipts, and we proceeded to function with the goal of becoming a museum. We first built a brand new basement in '99, and the church stood a little bit to the left. We built a brand new basement and moved the church over onto it. In 2001, we completely renovated the basement. It cost us more than $26,000 for heat, light, water, sewer, and all that. And last year, we finished the outside, including we replaced some of the windows. We put on insulation and new siding. We put on a metal roof in black to make it look very much like it did for the first 50 years, or the first years in the country. And so now it is complete as far as renovation is concerned, and we are now operating as the Krono Heritage Society. And we hope we're going to be adding another building outside the church here, a 2-room school which is not so particularly old. I believe it's 1926. Is up for grabs. The people want to give it away or they have to demolish it. And although it's very big and airy, it's going to be hard to heat and things, but we are acquiring that building and we'll see where it leads us. The idea is to move it onto some property out here without a basement, just on a grade beam, for more space, because when we put on a particular theme here, we have to return everything when we're done. We have no room to store things. The idea is to maintain the upper floor the way it looks here now. There's a balcony upstairs. There is a small Hammond electric organ up there. This organ that you see here was donated to us just when we opened last year as a museum. It was sitting in a place, and they wanted to give it to somebody who might look after it. We believe it's between 1870 and 1880 manufacture. We've had a look at the back of it. it needs to have more investigation. But around the top here, we are depicting the heritage of this community, and our theme is from free sod to turn and till. And it comes from a song that I knew, where it said that, people got this free sod, but they had to till so much of it each year. You had to till 4 acres the first year, I think it was, and 2 more the next year, and so on. Part of the requirements of getting a homestead. So this is information about the Prairie Pioneers, and it's going to stay and may be added to. And in the basement, in the lower level, we have a display that will change from year to year. Last year, it was the theme was school, and this year it's the war years downstairs. And in 2007, we're already planning for 2007, and it's going to be recreation and entertainment and what people did in their pastime. The church, of course, was operated in the German language until the early 50s. I was confirmed in the German language, as a Lutheran confirmation in I was about 15, I guess 1948. I believe Mona was as well, yet my wife was also confirmed till about 1951, 2, and that was about the last year. Then it switched to English. There were some German services here yet, but gradually more and more English, and now it's of course completely English, or was when it ceased operation.
Can you tell me what confirmation was like when you went through it?
Well, it was, it was a study of certainly the Ten Commandments, the Creed, some of the explanations of the Creed. I mean, for example, in German it says, "Ich glaube, dass ich kann nicht bei mein," it's the German for "I believe I cannot by my own strength believe in Jesus Christ or come to his, saving grace," and so on. So these were the kind of things. It was deep. I think it was deep. It gave you a feeling that you were joining some kind of a group that had, the Protestants, or particularly the Lutherans, are noted to be they're noted to be sort of theologically grounded. They have this deep theological sense coming from Martin Luther, who said it wasn't going to be by what you did or what you accomplished, it was going to be by the grace of God only, and that alone. And, that was what confirmation was about. And, of course, taking your place as a senior, as a voting member of the congregation. That's about the time most boys quit coming to church until they get married. And then their wives say, "Hey, we got to go to church," right? And that's what happens.
So when you were growing up and going to church, did the family sit together, or did...
No, the men sat on one side and the ladies sat on the other side, at least until the mid-60s or so. But when we were growing up, before 1950, when I was confirmed, no, the boys sat on one side, the men on one side and the women on the other, with some of the little children maybe. And the little children sat in the front rows, And there was a Sunday school before church started, and it had some large, an easel with some big pictures, colorful pictures that the pastor would talk about one or particular, some aspect of the that's in the Bible, Jacob's ladder or Daniel in the lion's den, or any one of these stories that he would talk about. And we also had Saturday school here. We just called it Saturday school, religious training on a Saturday. Now, it didn't occur every week, but it was every other week, and in the wintertime it might have been even poorer than that because of road conditions. But it was basically on, I believe, a semi-weekly, because you went to the other 2 parishes on another Saturday. And there we would be studying upstairs in that little balcony, some, 14 or 16 kids, maybe up to 20, and learning to read and write the script writing. Mona can do it. She can read and write it quite well. Yet I can study it, and once you get the first word or 2, you can figure out what the sentence is saying. But that was, some of the religious training, that is preparation for confirmation, and of course learning the alphabet and reading little stories and things. Yeah.
So did the altar look like this, like the church to look like this when you attended it?
Yes, it does, except that, it's been nicely newly. I'm not sure if it was the white color right away, but certainly for most of the time that I recall, it was like that. The lace cloth on the top there, my mother made. She crocheted that, and the one up here on the pulpit, she crocheted those. And once a year, she would take them down. There's a white cloth on top, and this crocheted border. She would take them off once a year in the middle of the summer, and she would take them home and wash them and starch them, so they would get stiff. And then when she came to put them on, you didn't want to be around, because it was stress and tension. Because Dad would help her, and they would put the little thumbtacks into it, and then Mother'd go there and she'd tug away at one corner and pull at it and tug it and stretch it a little bit, and she'd go to the other corner and she said, no, we have to take it back off. We have to move it, as she had a German expression, was ein Fingersbreit, a finger width. We have to move it one finger width to the left or right. And the Dad, very patient is the word I was trying to think of, very patient, would say, are you sure that it looks pretty good to me? And she'd say, no, but look at the flowers are not balanced. We have to move it. And of course, he knew the best thing was to go ahead and do it. So they would move this thing. It would be a 3 or 4 hour event. And then she would say, Gott sei Dank, das ist fertig für noch ein Jahr. Thank God that's done for another year. Yeah, I'm not sure. That doesn't take away a little bit from the dedication to. But anyway, she was dedicated to looking after those cloths, because that was what she had made, and she felt responsible for them.
So when you were a kid, how long did a church service last?
I don't think it was a great deal more than the hour. It might have been an hour and 20 minutes. Of course, it started with Sunday school. Sunday school might have been 10:30, let's say, and church at 11. And so, but the men wouldn't be in church at that point. The kids would be sitting in the front here. We had these little verses that we had to recite, memory verses, like one verse from the Bible, some memory verse, and you'd have to recite that. You usually studied that on Saturday night at about 8 o'clock at night. It was fresh in your mind. But it's amazing what you've learned as a child, what you'll remember, It's just amazing. And so Sunday school might be 10:30, I believe, and then church would start at 11. Of course, there's a bell to be rung at the back, and then, the men would file in after smoking in the yard, and I guess in the narthex, they smoked everywhere in those days. And then church would proceed, yeah. And it was about an hour, not much more, I'm sure, maybe 1:10 or so.
Your pastor, would he preach to you guys? Like he would face towards you? Would he stand up there? Or?
He would basically stand in the altar, in the pulpit there, yeah. Okay. Yeah. These days, pastors walk around, they get out of they walk down the aisle, maybe 2 or 3 pews in back. They'll have various props that they use, and they'll talk about a book or a film. No, it was pretty straightforward preaching, preach the word, yeah.
Did your church have a choir?
Yes, usually there was a choir of sorts, yes. I probably was in the choir when I was about 14 already, because Mona was in the choir, so why not? For one reason. But I had a good voice, and I sung a tenor, Mona's dad was a tenor, and of course he'd say, well, you come and sing with us, we need another one, It was always more women than men. Probably, you'd be lucky if there was 6 or 7 men and a dozen women. More recently, back before we were married, around that time, we would have pretty regular choir practice. I'm not sure it was every week, but it would be quite frequent, and sing especially for festive occasions, like Mission Fest and Easter and Pentecost and those kind of special events. The choir would definitely come up with 2 or 3 numbers. I usually sat in the choir loft there. Now we went to other churches and sang. I know there was a big opening of a new church in Regina when I was it was in 49, so I was 16 years old. We sang at that opening of St. Paul's Church, and which has now been demolished already, but it just didn't have room for it anymore. Yeah, choir practice.
Do you want to tell us how you and your wife came to be husband and wife? How the story of Mona and Wilf began?
Well, they got married. That's how they came to be husband and wife.
How did you get to know her, though?
Well, she lived a quarter mile from the church. She went to the same school as I went to. I kind of thought she was quite pretty when she was 10 or 12 years old, and of course, we didn't know. You know, we weren't into puberty yet. You didn't call her a girlfriend or a boyfriend or anything, but after, when we were probably 15 or 16 years old, I'm a year and a half more than her, so when she was 15, I would be nearly 17. There were a lot of dances held in Krono. The hall was just being constructed in 1948, so see, that would be 15 for me. And all the young people, everybody between 12 and, unmarried and even married couples, came to these weekly dances, and we danced. We didn't, there was no liquor, we never heard the word drugs was something that when you were sick you had drugs. But there was no liquor, there wasn't even Pepsi, there wasn't even lunch, nothing. You just came and paid 50 cents and from about 8:30 or 9 o'clock and danced till 12 midnight on a Saturday because you couldn't pass the clock. I mean, it was Sunday. And so you danced for 3 hours and went home. And, there was lots of fellowship, a lot of young people. When I mean a lot, I mean 15 or 20 that we belonged to a group of. And there was a couple that kind of, paired off a little bit here and there. One girl got married when she was 18. Her and Reinhold were dating for several years, and they were married in 52, and she's a year or two younger than I am. And Mona went to college in Regina, to Luther College, and I picked her up and took her back on weekends and stuff like that. Then we got fairly serious, decided to talk about marriage and agreed that it would be great, but she was determined that she needed to have a career, and she went in for 3 years of nurse's training. After the first year, we were engaged in August of 54, and we were married in 56 when she was through. So it was a long-standing. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary, which is really August 16, but this is July 26th. We celebrated on the 1st of July on account of vacation schedules. So I would say that we've been devoted to each other or committed to each other for some 55 years. Yeah. We're talking about the German language, and so I said I could sing a little German song, which I often do when we have visitors in the museum. This particular song is something that usually was sung at, I think, Mission Fest time, and it's called, the English is "We plow the fields and scatter." And so I'll sing the German of that, and then I'll sing the chorus in English. Wir pflegen und wir streuen den Samen auf das Land, doch Wachstum und Gedeihe steht in des Höchstens Hand. Sendet Tau und Regen und Sonn und Mondenschein. Von ihm kommt aller Segen, von unserem Gott allein. All good gifts and blessings come from the Lord above. So thank him now and thank him now for all his love. I'll sing a little German song that we learned in Sunday school, all of the kids, and particularly my sisters and I. My mother had us learning all these little songs. This one is about a little bird in a big tree, and how small it is and how insignificant, yet God looks after it, eh? Vöglein im hohen Baum, klein, dass man sieht es kaum, singt doch so schön, das Mahl von nah und fern, alle die Leute gern, horchen und stehen, horchen und stehen. And there's 3 or 4 verses to it, but it's about the little bird, like the sparrow, you know. God cares for the little sparrow. Okay, we're here at the site of the Chrono Heritage Cemetery. It's a municipal heritage site, and it was in very much neglect after about 1953 or 4. I think the last burial had been Otto Meyer over there, and I believe it says 51. So then people were buying plots in Regina because they came along with these memorial societies, and everybody was being buried there. And then we went out to Dilk, didn't we?
Yes, we were looking for my grandparents who had, when they came, there was no land left here. So they went to do their homesteading in Dilk. And then they lived there until they died, and they were put into a cemetery there. And we did find the grandmother's tombstone and learned too that he had been buried beside her. So we knew we had found them. But when we got to the graveyard, it was beautiful. It had a nice fence around it, a beautiful gate, and all the gravestones were just really kept up and propped up properly, and they had a map, and we were very impressed. And so as we're going out the gate, the one man drove by and he said, "Did you find what we wanted?" And we said, "Well, yes, we did." He said, "If you want to know any more about the graveyard, go down and talk to my wife. She's the one that's instrumental in getting this graveyard to look as it is." So we went to see her, and she had moved into or married into the community. And she said when she went to funerals, she saw these heaps of flowers on the grave, on the coffin. And she thought to herself, what a waste, and look at this mess that we've got here for a graveyard. So she got everyone to convert to giving, instead of flowers, they would give that money as a fund to smarten up the graveyard. And that is how they got that going. They even had a caretaker that was doing it with a little grass cutter machine. And it was just really nice. So we came home and we said, we are really ashamed of ours too, because people would come from far and wide, and we had to, practically machete our way into a tombstone. So that year, as we all said, there was a special year
grant available.
And a grant available for heritage sites. So that's when we got on the ball and we went to the church here. It was still running at the time, and said, "Look, that's a terrible mess. Can we get together and do something about this?" And that's what we did then too. Instead of the memorials being flowers, that they put their money into a fund, and we fixed it up.
And before we even got organized, the first opening is July the 21st. Before we even got organized, a man, well, in fact, it's right behind us here, Edward Leippi. Edward Passain died in April, and his wife said, "We'll bury him in the Chrono graveyard." And she had that much faith. And the relatives and stuff donated like $1,000 or $1,500, and we were off and running.
They already had plots in Regina, and they sold them.
They sold them, yeah.
And came here.
And since that time, this whole front row, like about 20 graves, have been used in the last 15 or so years. If we pass away, we intend to be buried here because our home is only 2 miles away, less than 2 miles. Then subsequent year, we first got organized. We were required to buy a marble plaque, which we'll film a little later. And then 2 years later, we got the big fieldstone monument made. We got the corner posts made. And one of the families, which you'll get a snap of later, built the gate there and donated it there's a plaque there. And I said I would build a little utility shed so we could keep some tools and stuff in it. And somebody said, "If you're going to build a little shed, why don't you make one in this, like the church, in the image of the church?" So I built that little building over there, and it's not in direct proportion, because if it was, the walls would be like 3 feet high, you know, so you have to
Take liberties.
take liberties. Yes, that's right. So we did that, and since that time we have quite a substantial, in the many thousands of dollars, we have a perpetual care fund here. It looks like it should have some grass cutting right now, and it probably will be cut in a week or so. We have a person here who comes regularly and cuts the grass and looks after the maintenance, so that it won't become a problem where one person tires out. We have an annual Heritage Day. It's now the last Sunday, roughly the 25th, 6th of June, when, the old-timers and the relatives of the people buried here come back here. We have a church service here, interdenominational church service. Then we go to the Chrono Hall or the rink, and we have a potluck dinner, and we give them a little information from the previous year, and we sing songs, and
hopefully they'll give us more money.
And we keep collecting money.
Keep up the
yeah.
care of it.
Now, so in this graveyard in 1985, I remember we started looking at there is a map we have at home, and there's about 155 graves. There's probably 175 now, and at that time, I think 95 of them were related in some manner to either Mona or myself, because Eitners are in her relativity, Beelers are mine, Leippis and Beelers, and Renners and Mona's relativity is Eitners and Wetsteins and Ecksteins. So we take a little bit of a look here.
Sounds good. Who are we standing next to? Whose gravesite?
This one is my grandfather. He came in 1905 and came with a sister and a brother-in-law, and he was the first of that family that came. And as I said, they did a homestead here. But then when his brother and his parents came a few years later, the land was all taken up, and so those people are in Dilk.
So did you get to know your grandfather?
My grandfather, yes, I knew him.
What type of a grandfather was he?
He was a grouchy old man. And he was when you have 15 children, you have to be a domineering person and in control, and he was. And he did a good job of that. And I think he was a good man to the community, because no matter who you spoke to, they always, if they wanted to borrow money or some advice or someone on a committee, Jacob Wetstein Sr. was on that board. So I think he was probably a good community man, but he was definitely a dictator ruler at home.
How far did he live from you, from where you were growing up?
About 3 miles.
So did you get to see him often, or?
He lived about 100 feet behind the church, immediately behind the church.
No, well, not when I was little.
Not when you were little,
He
no.
lived in
Yeah, a mile
Crosby.
east, yes.
Yeah. So we got to see him on a regular basis because he, like I said, had control of his children, and he would get up early in the morning and make his rounds to all the children and give them all a good scolding, and then he would go home and have a nap. And the only nice thing I remember about him, was before he left, after he had taken a strip off of both my parents, he would reach in the back pocket of his old car, and he had those sugar lumps that were like a little, it was a candy, but it was like a sugar candy, and he would give me some of those. That's my kind remembrance of him. Okay, this is his first wife. They had 7 children, and she died giving birth to the last child that died, so that would have been 8. And she was, all of about 32 years old. So that left him with 7 children. And my mother's father had been killed in an accident, And so he had a wife there in Watrous, and they had 7 children. And so he went there in order to get a wife and someone for his own children, and he would bring that whole family here, which he did. And then between the 2 of them, that's this wife.
She had 7 children.
She had 7 children, yes. And then between the 2 of them, they had 1 more. And she died giving birth to that one, but the little girl lived. That's about all about the 2 of them.
You never got to really know them.
No, they were like 30-ish, you know, and their children were like 15. I think my mother was 15 when they moved here, and probably about 13 or 12 when her own father died. So I didn't get to know those 3 at all.
They were married just about 1 year, that's all. And then his
January
second
to
wife
October.
died. Yeah.
Did you ever remarry again after that?
No.
I don't think he wanted to take another chance.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is one of my uncles, my dad's next oldest brother, Gottlieb Leippi, and his wife Ida. She just passed away in 2001. They lived closest to us, and my dad and my uncle Gottlieb actually farmed together quite a little bit. So we had quite a lot to do with him. He was kind of the most outgoing and gregarious of the uncles. He was much more active, and moved to Regina when he was only about 55 years old, and actually one of his daughters is buried right next to him. She was the first cousin of mine, the first Leippi cousin to pass away. She was only 56, I believe, or something like that, 57. I have another uncle just back here. We passed up Alfred and Margaret. He was the next oldest. He died a few years earlier.
Can you tell me what Alfred and Gottlieb were like when you were a kid?
Well, Alfred was more like my dad, you know, more studious. So he actually went to university, my Uncle Alfred, in about 1920s or so.
You want to tell us what Alfred and Gottlieb were like?
Well, Gottlieb was more outgoing. He was easier. He was more lively. Went to all the dances and everything. His wife was quite a lot younger than him. She was born in 17 and him in 06. So, you know, there was 11-year difference there. Alfred was more like my dad, kind of a quiet fellow, although he was probably the most educated of the group. He actually went to university in Saskatoon back, you know, in the 1920s, I guess, 25 or something like that. And they both lived about 3/4 of a mile away from our yard.
So did they have a lot of kids that you could play with?
No, the Gottlieb only had 2 children, 1 son and a daughter. I'm the only son in my family. Arnold is the only son in Gottlieb's family. And Alfred's have 2 girls and 2 boys. Yeah.
So smaller families.
Smaller families, yes, definitely getting towards smaller families. Although the youngest uncle, Otto, had 6. At the farm that we're living on, he had 6 children. Yeah.
Okay, this is my baby sister. I guess she was a year older than I. But she was a baby when she died. She got tonsillitis, if you please. But this was in 1933, and they didn't have penicillin at that time. And so she died with a very, very high temperature. And I know it was an extremely traumatic experience for my mom and dad to lose their little Hilda. And this is her here. I never knew her, of course.
All of the unmarked graves have these metal crosses that were put in about 40 years ago or 50 years ago. And we have a fairly close, detailed map which outlines who they should be. I have 2 sisters here. One was the first child in the family, was born in December and only lived 3 days. And I'm not really sure what got her, and I believe this is her mark here. The map would tell us. And then there was another child born, stillborn, in 1941, in August the 15th of 1941, and she's in a similar kind of a marked grave down here behind the bush. I'm just thinking now that that might be a project for the future to get a few gravestones here. We're standing in front of this little replica of Bethlehem Lutheran Church. It's not an exact replica because you have to enlarge on some of the sizes, but it was built and donated and contributed and donated by myself and my family in 1985 when we reorganized this cemetery. I was going to build a little tool shed of some sort, and somebody said, well, why don't you build a little church replica then if you're going to build something? And I thought, well, that's not a bad idea, so I did that. It was moved over here in a trailer. Actually, we had to have, it's 22 feet to the top of the steeple. We had to have the steeple off, and it was situated later on and screwed and bolted on. It has nothing inside of it, like it's just a place to store flowers and things like that. Now there's a bell in it, so I'm going to give the bell a little ring here. That's how we start our service when we have a service in June. And one day they'll be ringing that for me. This is a marble plaque that we were required to put up because the province in 1985 gave us funds just enough to actually buy that plaque. And we had to recognize that they contributed to it. It tells a story about the German people who came from South Russia ending up here. School, it says that the school was directly to the west of us here. The same width as the graveyard, but the space about 2 acres, which is to the west of us here. The school stood there, and that's of course where church started, in the schoolhouse, and then later moved to a site a couple of miles further to the east, where they actually built the church. And this tells the story of when they came and why, and the hardships that they suffered. And it says, erected to the glory of God this 21st day of July 1985, and that was when we undertook this rejuvenation of this cemetery. The pulpit beside it there is actually part of the original that goes way back. I don't know how far, but it's had extra pieces added to it and new steps put on it by myself. I cemented it into the ground so that it wouldn't blow around. The cross definitely goes back into the 30s. I don't know how much farther than that, but certainly goes back into the 30s somewhere. So it would be 75 years old.
So can you tell us a little bit about what a funeral was like when you were growing up?
Well, a funeral would of course take place in the church, and then everybody would get in their vehicles as they do today, and they would drive out here. As Mona said earlier, they would beat down some weeds and stuff because it wasn't terribly well cared for, although prior to the 50s they would have an annual day when they would come here in early June and kind of, take care of some housekeeping. The grave would have been dug basically by the local people. I remember helping several times dig a grave. In the wintertime it was quite something with frozen ground. But the grave would be dug and the earth pile would be beside it. There wasn't much of this covered with lovely green grass to camouflage it. It was a pile of dirt there and 6 shovels stuck into it. And the casket would be lowered with an apparatus that the funeral home would have, very much like today. The casket would go down, and then they would sing some really traumatic songs that just brought the floodgates open, and everybody would be crying. And then they would start to shovel the earth onto the casket, and I can still see and hear the first lumps of dirt hitting that lid, and that would really make people cry, as you can imagine, because this was definitely it, wasn't it, And then of course the men would take their suit jackets off and lay them aside, and they would keep exchanging shovels, and they would shovel the whole thing full of earth and close it up. Yeah. Fairly traumatic, because today we have taken some of that emotion out by having the ground isn't there. It's nice and green covered grass, although it's artificial, and the casket is just let down a foot or so, and we lay the flowers on top and we walk away as though it wasn't going to be covered in the earth. You know, of course it still is, we know that.